All right, so it looks like we have another installment in the Blanks Owen fans' turn on him. This one being Cenk Uygur. Now, not only are we going to talk about this incident of Cenk Uygur's fans turning on him or people just really going after him who are on the left, but we're going to talk about a more grandeur narrative about Cenk Uygur as well. But basically, what had happened was Trump sent out a tweet saying, well run states should not be bailing out poorly run states using the RONI as the excuse. The elimination of sanctuary cities, payroll taxes, and perhaps capital gains taxes must be put on the table. Also, lawsuit indemnification and business deductions for restaurants and ENT. So I'm not sure if he's trying to say that it's the red states that are good one the good states, which is pretty hilarious, just factually incorrect and numerically incorrect. Now, Cenk had a pretty spicy tweet in response. He says, if we had a Democrat with balls when we take over, they'd cut off funding to red states and make them beg for their handout. Almost all of them are welfare queens who live off the blue states. Republican run states are on average miserable failures who take more from the federal government. So it is true that a lot of those Republican states, and honestly probably most of them, especially when you look at like the South, I think I believe that the poorest state in the nation is Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken. So he's definitely right about that. Those states are incredibly poor. They don't really have much infrastructure. And I'm not really sure what you expect when you have such an anti government sort of stance and then you have no infrastructure or anything like that. I mean, why would your state be performing well? It doesn't really make any sense. So it is true that on average, yes, the Republican states are these sort of fail states essentially, and they do live off of these kinds of handouts per se. But they're obviously this is a very spicy tweet because what happens when you cut off funds to these people? Obviously, people who are poor in those states suffer. Now, it seems to be the case that most of the people that the left is worried about not getting the funds for are people who are lefties in Republican states. Because yes, despite being a vast minority or a minority in these states, they do exist. Lefties who are in these states like Alabama and stuff like that, they may be low amounts, but they're still there, right? Like 15% of the Democratic vote in Alabama going to Bernie Sanders. That's still a good amount of people, right? Still human beings, human life, right? Human life and a lot of human life. So that's obviously the spiciest piece of this, but also the usage of the term welfare queens. And what you've got to understand, and if you sort of read about the the past, from the 60s onwards, basically there were these sort of right wing, especially Lee Atwater. I recommend you look into him if you haven't already. They kind of came up with all these phrases that were like these covert dog whistles. Welfare queens is a massive dog whistle. Okay, it's this way to be like, it's basically the way to say like these blacks, especially I guess single mothers and stuff, eating off of our welfare and stuff like that. So it's definitely very spicy to use that. So if we look at some of these responses, he got taken down by everybody. Everybody was pissed off at him for this one. Cody Johnston just says, man, what? Anthony Fantano says, dude. Emma Vigeland says, punish the states as Republican leaders by publicly shaming them. Don't cut off funds for poor people in red states who need government assistance. Their social safety net is already threadbare as it is, and even strategically, this would be weaponized mercilessly by the right. Um, Now, it's an interesting comment here saying, punish the states as Republican leaders by publicly shaming them. I don't really understand how that works. I don't know if it's really possible. Now, I guess we'd have to try this, but I feel like the Republican leaders are so sort of, they're just, they're by definition shameless, right? Someone like Mitch McConnell, I feel like is shameless. I don't know what amount of shaming would get to them. So I'm not really sure if that's really a possibility. And then when you're talking about all poor people in red states, I feel like for people who are poor people in red states who are voting for like someone like a poor person voting for Ted Cruz or something like that, at some point you've got to sort of bear out what you're voting for. In my opinion, at least, you should deal with that kind of a thing. And the idea that it would strategically be weaponized mercilessly by the right, I don't know. I feel like that's more of an excuse for us to be kind of weaklings, to be honest. So you've decided to tweet this. Here's why you shouldn't have another meme. This is an atrocious tweet. We should not cut off funding to any states because the most vulnerable people are the ones who will suffer if we do. Also, please don't use this inherently derogatory and racialized welfare queen trope like this. Cenk, what the hell does this take? So obviously the welfare queen usage is a sort of I'm gonna flip it back on you type of thing. It's like when people ironically use the term cuck, for example. Like if I use the term cuck, I'm not literally calling someone a cuck. I'm using it as like a joke term, right? It's like you're using it. I don't. I think it's hilariously dumb, but I'm gonna flip it on you, type of thing. That's kind of what you do. That's what he's doing here. So, anyways, don't have to look at any more responses. You can go look at the tweet yourself because it's just nonstop, just people just going after him, just nonstop. Now he sent out a couple of tweets trying to clear up the air, saying for all the liberals hating on his tweet, let's go over how this normally works. 1. Republicans do terrible things to us. 2. We complain. 3. We don't fight back. 4. If anyone on our side fights back, we attack them as uncivil. 5. We lose. Hashtag fight back for a change. So he's definitely the spirit, I think, is kind of correct. He says, 2nd, I know a lot of you don't know me or watch the Young Turks, so you don't know. Of course, I'm not actually advocating to hurt people in red states. Progressive policies also get them healthcare and raise their wages. But rhetorically, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. And then he says, in response to the welfare queen term, he says, I can't believe people don't understand what I'm doing here. I'm flipping their own hateful rhetoric against them. If you can't stand that, then we're never going to agree on strategy, and you're never going to effectively punch back against the GOP. Being above the fray doesn't work. So what Cenk is doing here is he's taking up, a page out of Donald Trump's playbook, right? Double down, triple down, quad down, right? He didn't step down. He didn't even back up even an inch. In fact, well, I guess a little bit he did, but he kind of doubled down, essentially, is what he did. Now, what's pretty funny about this whole thing is that I actually I sent out a tweet about a grandeur narrative about Cenk Uygur. I said almost everybody hates Cenk Uygur. Right-wingers hate him. Neoliberals see him as the top devil. Leftists hate him. He gets hated on by everybody. And the reason why I said this is because I've noticed this, right? Everybody hates Cenk Uygur. Right-wingers hate him. We all know that. Neoliberals view him as like literally the top devil for them. He's like the face of the progressive movement that they hate. Even though, and this is the irony of it, he's the first one to be sheep herded into voting for the Democratic nominee. Even if it was Satan, he would vote for him. So it's hilarious that they pick literally the worst target because he's the first guy to be shilling to the progressive, audience and people saying, oh, vote for this corporate sellout that just perpetuates the system. He's the person to do that. But the neo-libs see him as the worst. Now, as you see, all of the people going after him on this tweet, those are lefties. Now, it's more of the socialist type on Twitter, but, I don't want to paint that as a broad brush. And so he just gets hated on everywhere. Now, funny enough, Cenk actually responded to this tweet. He says, anyone who fights back on the left is despised by all except actual human beings. My network has 18 million subscribers. Republicans hate me for fighting them. Neoliberals loathe me for pointing out their corruption. I think both those are true. And cancel culture leftists can't stand anyone who isn't them. And then he's partially right about that, I think. Wouldn't say fully, but he's definitely partially right about that last part. Now, I'm not particularly sure where he got the number 18 million from, but his network does not have 18 million subscribers. That's just not true. But, if that's what helps him sleep at night, I'm fine with it because the pressure and the stress that comes with something like being in Cenk Uygur's position must be insane. And so if something like inflating the number to 18 million is what helps him get by, you got to do what you got to do, right? Now, also, something interesting. TJ Kirk saying, it's making me like him probably out of pure contrarianism. Now, this is funny because I was seeing TJ Kirk actually defending Cenk Uygur on this one, which is surprising because that doesn't seem like a take TJ Kirk would take, but it looks like that's the route that he's gone, which is super interesting. Now, my take on his comment is this, okay? I see both sides of the issue, okay? I see both sides of the issue on this tweet because I both at the same time see how this can be damaging to poor. Now, to me, the group that I'm most concerned with are people who are lefties in these states. To me, if you're a Republican who's poor as hell and you're voting for a Ted Cruz or a Mitch McConnell, at some point you got to bear out what you vote for. And that may sound harsh, but it's the way life works. You're voting for someone like Ted Cruz, deal with his policies, and that's what you have to do. But let me give you an example of, what Cenk is kind of talking about here. So back when Obamacare was passed, and this is a huge issue with Obamacare. And so one of the biggest provisions of Obamacare was Medicaid expansion. Now, Medicaid is it's basically it's insurance for poor people, but it's run at the state level, and I think it's like half funded by state and federal funds. And so a big provision that gave millions of people more health care was Medicaid expansion, expanding Medicaid to more people. Now the problem was Republican governors, the vast majority of Republican governors, like, no, we're not going to accept this Medicaid expansion. And you know what's funny is when you look at like these states with like super high premiums, it's always these states that rejected the Medicaid expansion, which is hilarious. But so what Obama said, what he did was he was like, okay, if you're not going to take the Medicaid expansion, we're going to strip all of your Medicaid funding. And this is a common tactic employed by the federal government. This is not something new, guys. This is obviously, it's always been a thing where it's like, oh, the states doesn't want to align with what the Fed government is doing. Okay, well, guess what? We're going to withhold funds from you. We're going to withhold your block grant or something like that. And so what he was doing was, if you're not going to take it, we're going to take away all of your Medicaid funding, which the idea of that is to force the hand of Republican governors to take it. And I understand that strategy. And so I think that's the right strategy to take, as long as, assuming that the result is the Republican governors are actually forced into taking the Medicaid expansion. So it's definitely a tough situation. I see both sides, and there's definitely a level of harshness that's involved. I think that the group of people that I care for most that are at risk and vulnerable in this situation are lefties in right-wing states, because they obviously don't deserve to not have access to Medicaid and stuff like this. But that's really the only group that I'm seriously concerned with. People who vote for someone like Ted Cruz, I don't really have any concerns for. That's on you. But if you don't know, the Supreme Court case involving Obamacare actually struck down that provision of Obamacare. They said, no, you can't do that, Obama. So they didn't allow that, but they let the individual mandate go. They said that it was a tax on people without health insurance, and obviously one of the enumerated powers in the Constitution for the federal government is to lay and collect taxes. So it's an interesting back and forth. Let me know your thoughts are on this down below. Definitely curious to hear your thoughts.